So I'm a literary and cultural historian. That means I study literary texts, and also I've been interested in applying the techniques that we use to study literature to other cultural expressions such as music, visual art, and more recently dance. I started my PhD studying the literature and culture of early medieval Europe. After I did my PhD, I got interested in actually applying the techniques that I developed to study textual production and cultural production to what was happening in contemporary India. And I felt like applying those skills to answer a few questions, which for me was still outstanding as an Indian. What was the role of memory and forgetting in the way we think about ourselves today as Indians? What is the role of unresolved conflicts on cultural production and the way human beings feel and interact with each other in India? So these questions became for me magnets to apply my techniques of literary analysis to. And so for the next, I would say after my PhD, for about 10 years, I worked on issues of contemporary India. And so after writing 2 books on South Asia and producing some work on imperial medievalism, I started thinking about being kind of, if you like, a global subject, a global citizen interacting with others who have come through similar colonial and post-colonial processes but may not necessarily speak the English language. In that process, I kind of wandered into dance myself, so I started learning how to dance salsa, and all this opened up a completely new world for me of cultural production and how human beings behave with each other in the world. And that in a way shaped my current project. It's a 5-year project funded by the European Research Council in Brussels, and that's what I'm doing now. I wanted to write a book on Kashmir because, again, like all my research questions, the curiosity arises from something that I see is taken for granted all around us, but a fundamental question seems to be still unanswered. And for me, that question was, why do we obsess over Kashmir? Why are we so wrapped up with the idea that Kashmir is an integral part of India? And for me, the question was also provoked or crystallized, if you like, by a very close friend and colleague of mine, Professor Atto Quaison. And one of the questions he asked me at that point was, but what is going on in Kashmir? What is there? Is there oil? Is there some mineral wealth? And I had to pause and think, and that sent me off this research agenda to answer that question. I came up with the response that what Kashmir was then was not a space which was, kind of a space of economic value. It wasn't, it wasn't striated with oil fields or gold mines or whatever, but in itself, it had been created as a space of desire, a territory of desire, and that's the phrase I used as the title of my book. By territory of desire, I really meant all the processes, the discursive processes that went into imagining Kashmir in a particular way. I studied, therefore, all the ways in which Kashmir is imagined and reproduced for our imaginations in contemporary India. Because I'm a literary historian, I like to probe the histories of certain, representations we see in front of us. So if we see a Bollywood film, what prompted the camera to go there, to Kashmir in the first instance? So I then unraveled, if you like, a trail of the camera going beyond Bollywood, beyond 1947, to the earliest photographers anywhere in the world who were trekking to these kind of high altitude spaces, to Kashmir, to Ladakh, through the Himachal passes, to capture that terrain through their very early sort of photographic apparatuses. That was the moment in which the valley entered modernity, and entered modernity already framed and captured. And that was for me the, if you like, the extreme beginning, the first point where we can see a modern discourse around Kashmir emerging through technology. And Kashmir is a threshold space between British India and imperial Tsarist Russia, and is therefore part of the great game. And it's not just about seeking thrills of adventure to go and photograph there, but also about the high intrigues of empires. And that if you like, concatenation of political motivations and aesthetical capture of a space is what shaped Kashmir for us as a post-colonial nation. So if you like, I was taking a very different route through history to arrive at an understanding of what shaped the Kashmir conflict and hopefully coming to some kind of a resolution. I decided to write a book on partition because nobody had thought to connect the events of 1947 with the major events shaping our subcontinental geopolitics that had occurred after that. And because these events, for me, 1947 followed by 1971, were mapped onto an intergenerational grid, if you like, I could see how my interest in this in the conceptual apparatus around memory and forgetting, which I'm defining as post-amnesia, fitted very interestingly these events of 1947 and 71. They were kind of exactly a generation apart. And the phrase post-amnesia is a bit of a riff on another phrase, post-memory, which was developed by Professor Mariana Hirsch of Columbia University in New York, talking about the ways in which Holocaust survivors kind of transmit memories of surviving the Nazi death camps through generations down to their children, their grandchildren, and so on. So she uses the word post-memory, the memory that comes after memory, to indicate this process. But as I worked with post-memory, I kind of realized that that wouldn't fit our paradigm. So for me, post-amnesia actually was the best way to describe what I felt was happening to us as kind of third generation people moving on from 1947. If the generation of 1947 had a kind of task of remembering or not remembering, having to forget some of the traumas that occurred to them in that moment of independence and partition, the generation after that, which I was measuring as, say, my parents' generation, were perhaps engaged in an act of forgetting. I felt that my legacy was one of trying to remember that which had been forgotten. My post-amnesia is not going to be perhaps the same as a Bangladeshi's post-amnesia, as a Pakistani's post-amnesia, but we are somehow linked, and that was the task of the book, to find out that process of linking and connecting. After I worked for about a decade on matters relating to contemporary South Asia, I started becoming interested really in issues of trauma and how trauma is survived and resisted. And in a way, that led me to the entire experience of the African diaspora, which is a diaspora formed out of slavery and colonialism, and in fact what we can say is one of the most heinous episodes of global modernity. And since it's not a truism to say that the person who left in an enslaved condition the shores of West Africa and Southwest Africa was a person who had to leave without anything except what they had in their body as their embodied culture and memory, I felt that how interesting that it is this embodied memory that should then, over the next couple of centuries, be reformed into music and dance practices that initially were forms of resisting the brutalities of the plantation, and then, again in a bizarre twist of modernity, become the roots of rock and roll, disco, jazz, salsa, tango, all those kinds of forms by which, again, human beings all over the world are basically enjoying themselves on the space I call the dance floor. But that connection of fun with a very deep anterior history of resistance and survival, that broad story really led me to think about modern moves, which is about movements which we typically think of movements on the dance floor, but they are movements that have been formed through the modern history of slavery and colonialism. And my task in this project is to, again, draw all those threads together to mount, again, a new paradigm of understanding how human beings survive all kinds of brutalities, but yet manage to keep the human spirit going through creativity and self-expression and joy.